All right, today we're going to talk about someone you think you know, the Persian poet Omar Khayyam. But the man behind the legend is way more surprising than you might imagine.
Yeah, you've probably heard lines just like this, right? This is the Omar Khayyam everyone knows. The guy who was all about seize the day, live for the moment, drink the wine, enjoy life. For centuries, this has been his entire reputation.
But what if I told you that's not the real story? Not even close. The man the world knows as a poet of pleasure, well, his actual life's work had almost nothing to do with poetry. And that's the mystery we're unpacking today.
Okay, so first up, let's talk about the legend. Let's meet the literary superstar that the whole world fell in love with.
You see, the version of Khayyam most of us know is basically a Victorian-era invention. Back in 1859, this English writer, Edward Fitzgerald, put out a translation of Khayyam's four-line poems called the Rubaiyat. Now, I'm using the word translation very loosely here. It was more like his own artistic spin on them. But wow, it was a massive hit. It created this image of a wise, mysterious poet from the East who was all about wine and living for the moment. And people in the West just ate it up. We're talking everyone from Mark Twain to T.S. Eliot. Even Martin Luther King Jr. was influenced by this version of him.
But here's where it gets wild. The guy his own people knew during his lifetime, a completely different person. Seriously. The myth paints him as a poet of wine, but in reality, he was a top-tier philosopher. The legend calls him a hedonist, but history shows he was one of the most brilliant mathematicians of his age. He wasn't some dreamy Sufi mystic. He was an astronomer, a true intellectual giant. In fact, he had a title, Hujjat al-Haq, that had nothing to do with poetry.
So let's dive in and meet the actual Omar Khayyam, the scientist that history, for the most part, completely forgot. Yeah, back in his day, nobody was running around calling him a great poet. They called him Hujjat al-Haq, and that translates to the proof of truth. Just think about that for a second. That is not a nickname you get for writing catchy verses about roses. No, this was a title reserved for a master of logic, of science, of philosophy. People saw him as the successor to the incredible philosopher Avicenna. He was considered an imam, a leader of thought.
So how do you earn a title like the proof of truth? Well, for one, you solve problems that nobody else can. And that's exactly what he did in the world of mathematics.
Okay, so for hundreds and hundreds of years, mathematicians were totally stuck. They had figured out quadratic equations, x squared and all that. But cubic equations, x to the power of 3, they were like this giant brick wall. No one had a single, reliable method that could solve all of them. It was a huge, unsolved problem of the age. And this is where Khayyam's genius just absolutely shines. He looked at this algebra problem and thought, what if the answer isn't an algebra at all? He took a massive geometric leap. First, he did something nobody had done before. He systematically classified all the different types of cubic equations. Then, he proved you just couldn't solve them with simple tools like a ruler and compass. So what did he do? His brilliant solution was to use conic sections. Shapes like circles and parabolas. He figured out that if you found the exact points where these different curves crossed, that's where your solution was. It was a completely new way of thinking. And get this, he even showed that some of these equations could have more than one answer, which was a huge conceptual breakthrough for the time.
And he wasn't a one-trick pony. He also dug deep into Euclid's famous or infamous fifth postulate, the one about parallel lines. His work on that actually laid some of the very first groundwork for non-Euclidean geometry, something that wouldn't be fully developed for another 700 years. Oh, and he also figured out the rules for binomial expansion, what we now often call the Khayyam-Newton binomial. Yeah, he was working on that stuff centuries before Isaac Newton ever did.
Okay, so from pure math, Khayyam then turned that same incredible precision to the stars, to the cosmos. His next big project? Time itself.
I mean, his reputation was so huge that the Sultan himself, Malik Shah I, basically said, get me that guy. He brought Khayyam to the capital, Isfahan, put him in charge of a brand new observatory, and gave him one critical mission: fix our calendar. The one they were using was a total mess, drifting away from the actual seasons, and they needed the absolute best mind in the empire to sort it out.
And what he came up with? Well, it's just mind-blowing. The calendar he helped create, the Jalali calendar, is so ridiculously accurate that it's off by just one day every, wait for it, 3,770 years. Let me put that into perspective for you. The Gregorian calendar, the one you and I use every single day, is off by a day every 3,330 years. That means Khayyam's calendar from nearly 1,000 years ago is more accurate than the one we use today. Just wow.
So how on earth did he pull that off? Well, he and his team calculated the length of a single solar year down to 16 decimal places. 16! This isn't the work of some poet daydreaming about the clouds. This is the work of a hardcore, meticulous scientist at the absolute top of his game.
All right, which brings us full circle, right back to the poems. How do we square this guy, this master of logic and precision, with the passionate, wine-loving poet?
Well, this is where the plot really thickens. Because the deeper you look, the more you have to ask, which poems are actually his to begin with?
Think about it. Nobody who actually knew him ever wrote about him being a poet. The very first mention comes about 50 years after his death, and it's just for 2 little poems. But over the centuries, his name became so famous that other writers started attributing their poems to him, especially if they were saying something a little controversial. It was way safer to just put Khayyam's famous name on it. So you end up with thousands of poems under his name. Modern scholars have tried to sift through them, but it's tough. The general consensus today? Probably fewer than 100 of them are the real deal.
And when you actually look at the poems that are most likely authentic, a totally different picture emerges. They're not just let's party anthems. Not at all. They're the deep philosophical questions of a scientist. You can almost hear his logical mind at work, grappling with the big stuff. Why are we here? Why do we have to leave? What's the point of all this suffering? He's constantly questioning everything, even religious dogma. That's not hedonism. That's the sound of a brilliant mind hitting the absolute limits of what it can know and trying to make sense of it all.
So where does that leave us? What is Omar Khayyam's real, enduring legacy?
There's this one last, just beautiful story about him from one of his students. Khayyam apparently once said, quote, "My tomb shall be in a spot where the north wind may scatter roses over it every spring." Years after he died, that student went to visit his grave, and he found it right at the foot of a garden wall, with pear and peach trees literally dropping their blossoms all over the tombstone, exactly as Khayyam had predicted. It's like even when he was thinking about his own death, he was still the scientist, understanding the beautiful patterns of the universe.
When you look at his journey through history, it's just wild. He dies in the 12th century, known to everyone as a great scientist. Then boom, 700 years later, he's resurrected as one of the most famous poets on the planet. But now, in our time, the pendulum is finally swinging back. We're reclaiming his scientific legacy. There's a crater on the moon named after him, an asteroid too. And at the UN office in Vienna, there stands a statue celebrating him, not as a poet, but as one of Iran's great scientific minds.
So who was the real Omar Khayyam? The poet of the moment or the scientist of the ages? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the real truth is that he was that rare kind of genius, brilliant enough to be both. He was a man who used the cold, hard logic of math to map the stars, and then used the passionate wonder of poetry to ask what it all meant. And that fusion, that's what makes him so much more fascinating than any single legend could ever be.